Well, hello there. This is Pastor Paul speaking. You're watching the Believe It or Not, the Bible is Truth segment, which is produced from the Jesus movement. Last week we watched lesson one, and lesson one was about Abraham's city of Ur, what it was like, and that beginning of the journey in the Bible where God calls Abraham out to leave the city of Ur. This teaching and journey that I'm taking you on is a segment of the framework that's given by the Genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1. So if you open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 1, you'll see verses 1 to 13. It gives you a genealogy list which goes from Abraham all the way through the descendants until the time of Jesus. So we've started off with Abraham, and when we had the first lesson, we had a look at Abraham's city, what life was like, what he believed, what gods they would have worshipped, etc. So in this lesson, we're going to pick up where we left off from the previous one, and Abraham is in the process of leaving. He's assembled all of his shepherds, his family members, so his father Terah is with him, his wife Sarai is with him, and his nephew Lot is with him. So they take the shepherds and their family, and they take all of their livestock, and they start heading north in a northerly direction up the river Euphrates, and they're going to bypass Babylon, and they're going to bypass another city called Murray, which you might not have heard much about, which I'm going to teach about today. And they also went from there up until Haran, which is where they eventually settled before Abraham, much later, is called from there to leave his family and to go down into the land of Canaan. So just a couple of pictures for reminders. This was the city of Ur, as Abraham knew it, with a ziggurat and the main city dwelling, all the houses around, and the harbour in the background. If you want to see this and you missed it on the last lesson, please just go to my video channel and you can view this lesson to catch up on what happened in this segment. So Abraham assembles all of his animals, and off he goes, heading up north up the Euphrates River. So I'm just going to pop this map on just to bring you up to speed. So on the bottom right hand corner there, you've got the city of Ur next to the Persian Gulf as it was in the day. And you can see the trail there that heads up in a northwesterly direction all the way up to Haran, and this is where we're going to follow. So we just have a look at this and we wonder what some of the circumstances were. So we know that God called Abraham out of Ur, but in the previous lesson we also heard about how the Elamites, which are across to the right further there in today's Iran, had attacked and laid waste to the city. So there were situations that were occurring there that were not ideal as well. So there's perhaps other influences there, and other people were actually leaving Haran as well. So, sorry, I beg your pardon, were leaving Ur to go to Haran. So Abraham wouldn't have been on his own. There wouldn't have been an unusual group of people or shepherds herding their flocks to go further north again. So in this era, which was called the Dionysian era in relation to the Christian calendar, Terah was 70 years old at this point in time, and it was recorded that his son Abraham, who was born Abram, was born in 1995 BC. Now, other dating systems are similar, and there's different estimates dating Abraham's birth, but they're all come around 2000 BC or just after. So by the time Abraham was born, there was a major population shift from southern Mesopotamia happening, and they were heading north, and this had already been in progress for just over 100 years. So the path between the city of Ur and Haran was well trodden. This coincides with research that indicates that southern Mesopotamia was under the grip of a severe drought between 2200 and 2000 BC. The agricultural productivity of these Sumerian lands decreased due to rising salinity, and this was caused by poorly drained soil and high levels of evaporation because the climate was so hot and arid. So today, and I showed you these in the previous lesson, Ur is in this barren wasteland, about 120 kilometres from the ocean there, down at the Persian Gulf. So this process had begun literally 4,000 odd years ago, and it's historically documented. So the agricultural productivity of these lands was decreasing. Eventually the agricultural yields were severely reduced, and crops were changed from wheat to barley, which was much more salt tolerant. So once again, there's historical documentation for all this. The much lower yields, they contributed to a decrease in regional population, and apparently they dropped by 3/5 the size between 2100 BC and 1700 BC. So there was quite an exodus happening. This dramatic drought-induced decline of the population of the region significantly contributed to a shift in the balance of power. Specifically for the city of Ur, the decline in population left them susceptible to attack, which occurred when they were invaded and plundered by the neighbours, the Elamites from the east. But because the Elamites didn't remain to reign over the city of Ur, history records that the various Amorites residing in the region seized power for themselves before a later Amorite empire from ancient Syria came to rule over them. To the north of Ur, a city-state was found by French archaeologists when they dug through sand centuries old to uncover the city of Mari. So before we take a track up there, if you just have a look at the map there, you'll see there's Babylon, there's Uruk first, and then we go further up past Babylon, and there was a slide that I placed there last lesson to give you an idea of what that looked like, with the hanging gardens, and of course the Tower of Babel in the background that was built up to reach into the heavens. Now, the city of Mari, and I'm just popping that slide up now, it was quite an extraordinary looking place. So you can see it sitting there beside the Euphrates River. You can see the meandering nature of the Euphrates River, which is quite normal for river systems. And you can see how there's been a canal that's been dug out of that river and passes right through the middle of the city to create a safe harbour within the city itself. So this city was located between Mesopotamia, as it was called, which is western Persia, so it's in today's Iran, in fact, and Karshemish, which is the border between today's Turkey and Syria, and parts of Anatolia, excuse me, which is towards today's Turkey. Now, the location of Mari was favourable for trade due to its central position in the Fertile Crescent. It was accessible by both land and water. So again, I'll just flick back over to there. You can see where Mari is. It's pretty much right on the, almost in the centre there of the Fertile Crescent. You can see the confluence of the rivers above it there, and it's well and truly a bit of a zone where there's some green from all of the water systems there. So it was a good place for irrigation and for farming. And if I go back to the picture of the city of Mari there, you can see all the fields that were placed outside the city. And then you can see the escarpments which raise up into the deserts either side. So the course of this river, this meandering river over the period of time, had cut away into the escarpment, and that lower lying ground, as the river floods each year, would actually pour silt excuse me, and minerals, which would bring this richness to farming there. Now, Abraham would pass the city of Mari on his way to Haran, which is a great benefit because he could buy supplies there. And history records that they used to sell things there such as dates and olives and grains. So Mari's inhabitants also had gods that they worshipped there. And the interesting thing in these ancient days is different cities, some of them worship the same false gods, but in fact some of them also had their own particular pantheon of gods. And in the case of Mari, their inhabitants worshipped an array of different gods and goddesses. And I've just got some examples here, which I'm going to show you, just to give you an example of some of those. So the first one I'm going to show you, I'll just pop up that slide, is called Dagon. And Dagon was the god of storms in Mesopotamia. Now you might recall when you read the Bible later on with the Philistines, Dagon was also the name of the god that was in the temple where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. And I'm going to come to that in a future lesson, but Dagon, the fish god, became a god amongst many cities along the edge of the Mediterranean, and those included Sidon further north, and the many the Philistine cities further to the south. Now, on that picture there, you can see an ancient tablet there, which shows you these particularly strange images, and they show the what looks like a fish with arms and legs coming out, holding a bit of a basket. So, on the right-hand side, I've gone to the trouble of drawing this illustration, and you can see it in colour, all very clear there, and you can see how it basically looks like a man there who would probably be a priest, and he's got this fish, the head over the top of his head and the balance of the fish over his back. So I just pray that that was a symbolic thing and not a real fish, because that would have been one particularly smelly priest for anyone to go to. Now, the next god I'm going to illustrate was actually a goddess, and goddess was called Ishtar, and there's many movies been made even today about this particular god and a goddess, and she's written into books and given all these special powers. But in the day, she was known as a goddess of fertility, and fertility was always a big issue in those days because they were looking at prosperity. So they believed that, fertility both as people, giving birth to children, also for all the livestock and the animals, that it was a very necessary thing, and even fertile lands and soils for them to grow their crops in. So the goddess of fertility, Ishtar, was of great value to them. And of course, another one was Shamash, which was a sun god. Now, the sun, the astral deities, the sun, the moon, and the stars were well worshipped pretty much everywhere. And in that picture, if you look in the middle, you can see that circular emblem with what appears to be a man above with a rope holding it in place. The king is there off to the right, and the people from the priesthood are serving to the left. Now, this was actually a sun god, so now we've got a fertility god, a sun god, and we've got a god of storms that we've talked about. So in those days, this wasn't the living God as we know him. These were all false gods, and they believed that if they made sacrifices and tithes some of what they produced, that they could always appease the god. So the purpose of appeasement was simply to encourage the god, supposedly, to, I guess, bless them in some strange way, that they would receive more if they made a sacrifice to this god. And such was the order of societies in those days. Now, obviously, the worship of these gods extended to sacrifice of many things, and they would bring libations for fluids, such as wine and water, etc., and even juices. But they would also bring parts of their harvest, their crops, to sacrifice, and their fruits, etc. They would also bring livestock to sacrifice, and unfortunately, it was common practice that human beings were sacrificed as well, and especially for fertility. Funnily enough, they would believe that sacrificing a human child would allow them to be more fertile in order to have many more. So, obviously, a very bizarre practice, and obviously a very disgusting and horrific practice. But such was the times, and this was the times that Abraham lived in. Remember, he was called out by God, which means he was set apart from all other people. So wherever he travelled, everybody was worshipping various gods. They were all sacrificing things. So having been a man that had met God face to face, you could imagine how abhorrent and disgusting this was, and how he must have felt, because he was one of those people that used to worship the moon god down in the city of Ur. So Abraham's life had taken a real shift. In fact, he was on the move because God had called him to move. So at this point in time, that's why Abraham's known as the father of faith, because he'd only just met with God, and he had agreed that he would be obedient to him, and he was moving those members of his family heading up to Haran. So I hope that gives you some sort of an outline, a bit of an understanding of what's going on up there. Now, when they were in Mari, it's an interesting place, because there's actually, from archaeological digs that have been done there in the mid-modern era, there's been a lot of tablets and figurines, etc., that have actually been found. Now, we know that Mari's inhabitants worship these various gods because they have figurines of these gods and tablets which note whom they worshipped and what was the sacrifice, as the priest would always record all these things. So Mari, which is in Tel Hariri on the Euphrates River today, is slightly north of the border between Syria and Iraq, and it was ruled by a king called Zimri Lin in the 18th century BC, because his palace ruins were uncovered along with 25,000 clay tablets written in an ancient cuneiform script. We can actually know much about what this was like. So on this page you can see a figurine there, and the figurine is of Ebi, and Ebi was a superintendent in Mari, so he was a figure of importance, and you can give a bit of an idea of how they used to appear. So the head was shaven, they have these woven sort of skirts that they wore, probably from reeds I would imagine, and they've got their traditional beard. So Ebi was a superintendent of the priesthood, and so there's a figurine made of this important public figure. The other picture that's sitting there is actually one of the 25,000 clay tablets that was found. And you can see the cuneiform. So if you look at the lines on there, you can see how they would use a stick. You can see the wider edge and the thinner edge. And they would basically press this end of the stick into the clay when it was soft. And they would note all the different words and numbers in various patterns. And then when the actual clay was hardened later, when it was fired, you would have this page that had writing on there, and of course they've been preserved through a very long period of time, and we can see those today. So they allow us to verify all of this information. Okay, so some of the tablets, they're actually dated up to 200 years before Zimri Lin's time, from the period when Abraham's family departed from Ur. Now the Mari tablets reveal, in addition to agricultural problems that were experienced at the time, that there was troubling political and cultural problems as well that would have given Abraham comfort in responding to God's call for their immigration. Up to this time, many Amorites from the land east and west of the Jordan River, which you can read about in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verses 44 to 49, they had also forced their way as nomads into the south of Mesopotamia. They were searching for fertile lands to graze their herds. They too began to emigrate around 2100 BC because of the regional drought that was affecting most of the Near East. This only served to further destabilize Ur. Now, the Sumerian lands around where Ur was had always been known to be fertile, but now they were suffering. They were increasing salinity caused by these poorly drained soils and the high evaporation from the hot weather. So the climate was becoming drought-stricken, and it was contributing to the declining health of these grasslands and fruit crops. So the lack of good food crop yields and grazing around the city of Ur, it impacted the population severely. It caused movement away from the southern Mesopotamia and the city of Ur. So you can just imagine that Abraham, called out at this time with his family and his herds, he would not have been especially noticed as he travelled and migrated further northwards. So even with this severe drought that affected the Near East region, the city of Ur in decline was still a great prize for foreign invaders. Now, history reveals that the city of Ur suffered repetitive attacks to plunder its resources before it was finally sacked by the Elamites. Now, even though Abraham was born after this, in a somewhat politically, culturally and economically fractured city, it was still pretty vibrant, because you might remember in the previous lesson I mentioned there were 65,000 people that lived there, which makes it one of the largest, or is believed to be the largest city at the time. So it would have still been pretty vibrant. So when the Amorites went down there and they restored the rule, they would have got on with a pretty powerful economy still. But regardless of all of this, called by God, with these circumstances going on around him, it wouldn't take much for Abraham to move his family away from the city of Ur. So the point of all this is that when God calls us in life, we can look at that as a spiritual call upon our life. However, we live in this world. God created us to live in this world. So we have a foot in this world. So the things that happen in this world affect us as well. So you can imagine when God came and visited Abraham and called him out, with all of this stuff going on with the previous attacks and the problems with the climate and the decline in trade, etc., you can imagine when God called him out, he would have been encouraged to say, you know what, things aren't so good here either, so I'm going to be obedient, I'm going to follow God, and no doubt he's going to be led into a promise which is much better than what he was leaving from. Now, the nomadic description for Abraham in the Holy Bible, it's well supported by historical evidence. Responding to God's call, he went to the land of Canaan, but instead of going across the desert, of course he goes northwest. So to go to the land of Canaan, he was probably not going in what you would assume was the right direction. But because the city of Ur was near the mouth of the Euphrates River on the Persian Gulf, it would have been impossible to go south. West, well, as I just mentioned, there was nothing but desert. And east, there was refugees from Ur would encounter the Elamites, who were people that had been coming and slaughtering them, so they wouldn't want to head that way either. So both biblical historians, archaeologists, they deduce it was logical for Abraham to take his family northwesterly to save their lives, as it was necessary to follow a source of provision. Now, this provision clearly was grazing and water for their livestock, and the ability to replenish their provisions by trade or purchase from the settlements, towns, and cities along the Euphrates River. Obviously, I'm highlighting a couple of the major cities. Now, after washing the world clean from sin during the Great Flood, the attempt to build the Tower of Babel shows that people quickly abandoned God once again. And although God scattered the people and mixed up the language, which you can read about in Genesis 11:7, to stop the tower from being finished, mankind continued to worship other gods and build temples in their honor. So Abraham was no different to his fellow men. He too worshipped other gods. So when the only true living God appeared to Abraham, he called him to abandon his idolatrous ways. He offered a personal relationship which was impossible with any of these other gods that we're mentioning, and he established a covenant relationship, which is a contract that demanded undivided loyalty. Now, clearly Abraham, by his obedience to God's call, chose to step forward into a life of faith, and we know this period, and we call this the period of the patriarchs. So Abraham, of course, was the first patriarch because he is the father of the faithful, the first man who was called out by God to be obedient and to follow in his steps. So obviously when Abraham left this city of Ur, he'd not known any other place, and he'd grown up as his father's son. He worshipped Nana, the moon god, his whole life, and participating and practicing worship and sacrifice at the ziggurat, known as Etameneger, he had lived in fear and practiced abominable things in the understanding that it was necessary to satisfy this unknown God. So this is Abraham. You know, our father of our faith was a man who worshipped and sacrificed to appease unknown angry gods. So this unknown God, of course, was the moon god. So all that they would have saw was in the night sky above the city of Ur, the moon itself. And that's all that he knew. So in Joshua 24, verse 2 in the Bible, it tells us that Abraham also worshipped other gods. So we know that they worshipped the moon god, but there was obviously a pantheon of other gods available as well, some of them which I've mentioned. So he would have believed that there were many gods, different gods who commanded different realms of nature. And then one day when he came into the presence of the God of glory, as our Father is called in Acts chapter 7 verse 2, who appeared to him and said, "Leave your country and your people and go to the land I will show you," which is written in Acts chapter 7 verse 3. The presence of the only true living God shook Abraham to the core. Not only did he learn he had been brought up to worship other gods, but he faithfully obeyed the Lord and left his home to go to a foreign land. He placed his trust in the Lord, for God had appeared to him and spoken to him, dispelling any doubt of his sovereignty. Leaving the world's largest city, Abraham undertook this arduous journey northward with his family. He retraced the footsteps of his forefathers who had actually come down the Euphrates River right back to the time of Noah. Now, he followed its twists and turns, as I showed you in one of those previous pictures when we were looking at Mari. So it's a winding river that he was actually following until he came across Mari, in fact, as we mentioned. And although it was a well-trodden trade route, it was slow going. Moving on foot, he led his family herds and flocks in the heat and the dust. So this picture or this illustration, you can sort of envisage all these animals traveling along, then walking along in the heat. So it would have been slow going and pretty unpleasant. Now there's estimates that have been calculated about how far could you actually travel in this method? And they provide that shepherds moving with their possessions and their animals, they're only limited to cover a distance of about 6 miles a day. In kilometres, that would be about 9.6 kilometres. So we can see that this travelling that they had to do, it was not going to happen quickly. So when they got up to Mari, they would have taken a respite, no doubt. Abraham would have taken the opportunity to replenish their store of fresh food for the ongoing journey. And so I'm just going to pop that picture on again to refresh your memory. So they would have stayed there and entered the city. Now, Mari was known for its dates and its olives and its grains, and those things were brought for cereal, to make bread, to accompany the meals. Abraham, when he was there, he would have saw many temples, because the inhabitants of Mari worshipped many deities. I've mentioned Dagon, the god of storms, Ishtar, the goddess of fertility, Shamash, the sun god, but there would have been many others as well. So, but these things that Abraham would have gone to if he hadn't have met with our Heavenly Father, these things wouldn't have interested him anymore. So he would have entered these cities, and normally that would have been the first thing they would have gone to do when they're traveling, would have been to go to these various temples and make their offerings for their continued safe passage. But now this spectacle wouldn't have interested him, because he was walking in faith and obedience to God. So as they travelled, they had these black goat hair tents. So Abraham would have led his people all the way along this journey. They would have been pitching and pulling down these tents along the way. They would have been following the banks of the river to provide the necessary water. And they in fact covered 800 kilometres or 500 miles. That's the distance that he travelled. So when they reached Haran in northern Mesopotamia, they would have been travelling relentlessly for 3 months minimum, based on the estimate of travelling 6 miles or 9.6 kilometres a day. So again, to go from the city of through to the city of Haran in these ancient days, so from southern Mesopotamia to northern Mesopotamia, from southern Iraq up to the base of southeast Turkey, they would have travelled for 3 months. Now, Genesis 11, verse 31 says, "But when they came there to Haran, they settled." So basically, they took a rest. Now, the thing that we don't know is why they stopped in Haran. We don't know why they settled in Haran. Haran as a place, it was like in some ways, because it was actually a major hub for moon god worship. So in Samaria, which is down south in where the city of was, this is the god that they call Nana, because of the language in Sumerian. Now here in Haran, the same god, the moon god, was actually called Sin, and that's because it's in the Akkadian language, but the actual god was the same. So for the many people migrating from because of all the geopolitical and environmental problems they were experiencing, it perhaps might have seemed a natural destination for them to head for. But for Abraham, who was called to go to the land of Canaan, it just doesn't seem to make sense. However, due to the necessity of water and grazing for livestock, going westwards to the land of Canaan was definitely not an option, for it would necessitate the dangerous crossing of the Syro-Arabian desert. So it was necessary to travel within the Fertile Crescent along the many trade routes to ensure a safe journey. So although God called Abraham, we can know that this new faith extended to his whole family, because his future grandson Laban made an oath with his other grandson Jacob that states, "May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us." And that's in Genesis 31, verse 53. So we can speculate why Terah and Nahor stayed in Haran. Perhaps Terah was weary with age and had no desire to travel any further. But, we're going to have to see what the Bible reveals. So we're going to finish up here at this point, and we're going to go into what the Bible reveals about Abraham leaving his father to head down into the land of Canaan in the following lesson. So I just pray that you've enjoyed this teaching today. I hope it's opened your eyes to some of the reality of Abraham's journey, the distance he travelled, why they went the particular way that they went, and also some of the false gods that they would have been encountering, which Abraham has had to turn his back on. So thanks for joining me for this lesson, and we'll see you for lesson 3 soon. Bye for now. Now, just before I pop off, I I'm just going to remind you that all of this teaching comes out of a book that I've been working on for many years called The Journey to Faith. So that's due to come out next year in 2019. So when that comes out, I'll be putting out a notice about that, so you'll be able to avail yourself of a copy. Also, at the end of this slide, there'll be two windows that pop up on the slide. One of them on the bottom right will be to click on for the following lesson, which flows on from it, and the one on the left is a button to actually subscribe to my YouTube channel. So when you see those icons, if you'd like to subscribe or you'd like to sit and listen through the next lesson, just please press onto either of those buttons, and you'll be able to enjoy those. Thanks very much.